There's a widespread belief that courts gain jurisdiction simply because the statute says so. That authority simply exists automatically the moment somebody is brought in front of a judge. But when you look deeper into how the legal system actually functions, a different mechanism becomes visible. Jurisdiction is often established through classification, language, and procedural framing. In other words, through how a situation is described and interpreted before any ruling is ever made. And at the core of this idea is a three-stage process, sometimes described as label, lens, lock-in. And understanding those three stages changes how you see legal proceedings entirely. The first step is classification. Before a court can exercise its authority, the matter has to be placed into a recognised legal box that might be called a claim, an offence, a liability, a debt, a breach, an obligation, a duty, a contract, a tenancy, a regulatory matter. Once something is labelled, it immediately connects to an existing body of law. For example, calling something a fine instead of an invoice, calling somebody a defendant instead of a respondent, calling an event an offence instead of an incident, calling a payment a penalty instead of a fee. These labels are not neutral, they do carry legal consequences. In statutory systems, words are defined very precisely. Stage 2 lens, interpreting through legal definitions. Once a label is accepted, the framework attached to it comes with it automatically. After labelling comes interpretation. The court applies what can be thought of as an analytical lens, meaning that the situation is viewed through statutory definitions and precedent rather than everyday language. Ordinary words have multiple meanings. Legal systems select one meaning and treat it as authoritative. Some examples of common terms that change meaning under legal interpretation. So the same word can mean something entirely different depending on context. This is what people often refer to as legalese, specialised language used to trigger legal frameworks. Stage 3, lock-in statutory definitions control. Once a label is accepted and interpreted, definitions become binding. At that point, the statutory rules take over. This is the lock-in phase, where jurisdiction is considered established because the category exists in law. The definitions apply. The procedural rules attach automatically. In practice, this means that jurisdiction can arise through signing documents, failing to object to classification, participating in proceedings, accepting terminology used in notices, responding without challenging assumptions. The legal system operates heavily on procedural acceptance. Language categories often used in legal framing. Some analysts group legal terminology into conceptual clusters that trigger regulatory authority. Examples include financial obligation language, such as fund, contribution, yield, return, account, portfolio, subscription, liability, settlement, and administrative fiduciary language, manager, trustee, custodian, administrator, officer, agent, representative, compliance and regulatory language, compliance, audit, inspection, reporting, notice, enforcement, breach, remedy, relief. Each cluster connects to specific areas in law, such as financial regulation, administrative law, or contract enforcement. Private versus public framing. Another concept sometimes discussed is the distinction between public/statutory matters and private agreements. In mainstream law, private agreements still operate within statutory frameworks, but the other distinction matters because different procedures apply depending on classification. For example, contract disputes, commercial arbitration, trust arrangements, private settlements. These are forms of what legal scholars call private ordering, where parties create their own arrangements within the boundaries of the law. Private ordering is a recognised academic concept, referring to systems where individuals structure their relationships without direct government intervention, though still enforceable through court if disputes arise. Procedural jurisdiction, how courts actually obtain authority. In formal legal theory, courts obtain jurisdiction through three main elements. 1. Subject matter jurisdiction, authority over the type of case. 2. Personal jurisdiction, authority over the parties involved. Or 3. Procedural jurisdiction, proper filing, service and process. Language plays a role because documents, filings and responses determine how those elements are satisfied. Examples of verbal triggers in legal documents. Certain phrases commonly appear in notices and court paperwork. You are hereby required. Failure to comply. Pursuant to statute. It is alleged that you are liable for, within jurisdiction of, deemed service, without prejudice, by operation of law, in default, whereas, herein, thereof, notwithstanding. These phrases are procedural signals. They connect the document to the legal authority. In some systems, cases move between courts through procedural certification. For example, enforcement actions may be transferred from one level of court to another, using prescribed forms and authorisations. Once transferred, a higher court reference number or writ may be issued. This is simply procedural hierarchy, but it illustrates how authority flows through paperwork rather than physical action. The core insight. Whether one agrees with alternative interpretations or not, one point is undeniable. Law is built on language. Courts do not operate through physical force at first. They operate through definitions, classifications, documents, procedures, acceptance of terms. Authority emerges from structure, and structure emerges from words. Part 2. Participation, procedure, and the jurisdiction feedback loop. So if jurisdiction can begin with classification and language, the next question becomes, what strengthens it? The answer is participation. Legal systems are procedural environments. They rely on responses, filings, appearances, and actions from the party involved. Every interaction feeds information back into the system and reinforces the framework that's already applied. This creates what we would call the jurisdiction feedback loop. Appearance versus presence. One of the most important distinctions in legal procedure is the difference between physical presence and legal appearance. In everyday terms, those sound identical. In legal procedure, they are completely different concepts. An appearance can occur through filing documents, responding to correspondence, entering a plea, submitting forms, accepting service, communicating with the court in an official capacity. Even written communication can be treated as participation within the legal process. That doesn't mean that jurisdiction is automatically created by replying to something, but procedural law often treats engagement as acknowledging proceedings, consent in legal systems. Another misunderstood concept is consent. Legal consent does not always mean a verbal agreement. It can arise through conduct, actions, failure to object within time limits, signing documents, accepting benefits, following procedural instructions. This is sometimes referred to as implied consent or consent by conduct. For example, paying part of a demand, negotiating terms, requesting extensions, filing responses, attending hearings. Each action can be interpreted within procedural rules as a recognition of the process. Presumptions, the silent mechanism. Legal systems also operate heavily on presumptions. A presumption is an assumption treated as true unless unchallenged. Common procedural presumptions include service is deemed effective after a time period, documents are presumed received, statements are presumed accurate unless disputed, authority is presumed valid unless challenged properly, official acts are presumed lawful. If presumptions are not addressed within procedural timelines, they can become accepted as facts in the case. This is one reason why deadlines are so important in legal proceedings. Terminology that signals authority. There are certain phrases that often indicate procedural power is being exercised. Examples include deemed, hereby, pursuant to, notwithstanding, without prejudice, by operation of law, in accordance with, whereas, thereunder, hereinbefore, for the avoidance of doubt, failing which, take notice that. These phrases are not decorative. They connect statements to legal mechanisms, capacity and role assignment. Another key element in jurisdiction discussions is capacity. Legal systems recognise individuals in different roles depending on context, such as defendant, claimant, respondent, applicant, witness, officer, director, trustee, tenant, licensee, debtor, creditor. The roles assigned determined which rules apply. Example, being classified as a tenant activates housing law. Being classified as a driver activates traffic law. Being classified as a director activates company law. The label determines the legal framework. Remedies versus relief. Language differences also appear in the outcomes. Some legal traditions distinguish between a remedy, a solution provided by law, relief, assistance granted by a court. Both refer to outcomes, but terminology can vary depending on context, such as civil procedure, equity, or administrative or admin law, because I can never pronounce it. Examples of remedies or relief include damages, injunctions, orders, declarations, specific performance, restitution, enforcement actions. Again, language determines classification, which determines authority. Procedural hierarchy and escalation. Court systems operate in layers. Matters may move between levels of certification, transfer, or enforcement procedures. Once transferred, new references or authorizations can be issued that expand enforcement power. This is simply administrative structure, but it demonstrates how authority flows through paperwork rather than physical control. The structural reality, regardless of different viewpoints about law, there are some objective facts. Courts operate through procedure. Procedure operates through language. Language creates classification. Classification determines authority. So jurisdiction is not just about the power. It's about the structure. And structure is built from definitions, roles, documents, timelines, participation, interpretation. The most important takeaway, the biggest misunderstanding people have about courts is thinking that authority begins in the courtroom. In reality, the process usually begins long before that, in paperwork, in notices, in classifications, in responses, in procedural steps. By the time somebody has entered a courtroom, much of the framework has already been established. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Bye for now.